said, why don't I get started? And the title of my talk tonight is Time Bomb: How the Common Conception of Intelligence is Taking Down Humanity. And I'll also talk about what I believe we can do about it. So here we go. And if you have any difficulties hearing me or understanding me, let me know, and I will try to fix it.
Bob,
Yes.
if you can just make it a presentation view, would that
Sure.
be
Yeah, we'll
possible?
make it presentation mode. Is that better?
Yes, better. Thank you.
All right, here we go. So the main message of the talk is that the common psychological conception of intelligence that we have been taught in our psychology courses and that pervades our countries has been and continues to be a disaster. I'm going to argue tonight that it's taking down humanity. We can do better and implement a conception of intelligence that points to a better future, not a much worse future for humanity. And this is important for those of us who teach psychology, because I believe we often have misconceptions not only about intelligence in general, but about the intelligence of our students. And I have to say that I have a bit of a personal stake in all of this, because I became interested in intelligence when I was a child in elementary school, and I failed IQ tests. I like to think because I was test anxious. But my failing these tests when I was 7 or 8 years old got me interested in intelligence testing. And then in 7th grade, when I was 13, I did a project on mental testing where I devised my own intelligence test and gave the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, which I found in the library of my hometown, to some of the children in my class. And the crazy thing is that my triplets are now the age I was when I was giving these IQ tests, although I don't think they're going to be giving IQ tests to anyone. And I got into serious trouble when the head school system psychologist discovered that the 7th grader was giving IQ tests to his classmates. So the head school system psychologist came to my school, pulled me out of social studies class and yelled at me for 50 minutes, the length of the period, ending with, if I ever brought the book into school again, that's with the book Measuring Intelligence that had the 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, he personally would burn the book. And it was pretty much at that moment, when I was age 13, that I decided that I would make a career studying intelligence and try to understand what I was so bad at. Unless you think that this was an isolated event, when I was a freshman in college at 18, I went to Yale University. I took an introductory psychology course with several hundred people in it. And on the very first test, the professor handed out the test back to us students in descending order, from the best grade to the worst. And when I got my test, I was very near the bottom. I got 3 out of 10. And the professor said to me, you know, there's a famous Sternberg in psychology, and it's obvious there won't be another one. So apparently I was fulfilling the destiny of my IQ test scores. And I decided, yes, I have to study intelligence. But what I'm going to argue is that if we study intelligence, we do not want to study intelligence as it's usually conceived. In the talk, I'll be presenting my own opinions on humanitarian crises, which you're welcome to share or not share as you wish. So this is my book, Adaptive Intelligence, and part of my talk is based on the book. I'm sorry I have a bit of a cough. I have this perpetual allergy, and it's coming to me tonight. Okay. So only one species is known to commit mass suicide, and it's not the one that people often believe commits mass suicide. It's not lemmings, it's humans. Humans are waging a suicidal war on nature. UN Chief Antonio Guterres said, "Our planet is broken. Humanity is waging what Guterres described as a suicidal war on the natural world. Nature always strikes back and is doing so with gathering force and fury," he told a BBC special event on the environment. The UN had warned that Earth is sleepwalking to climate catastrophe. The problem is getting worse, he said this morning. He added that the goals world leaders agreed on to limit global warming are on life support. Moreover, humanity is financing its own extinction. The world spends $1.8 trillion a year on subsidies that harm the environment. Research prompts warnings that humanity is financing its own extinction through subsidies that are damaging to the climate and wildlife. This is Ella from London, UK, who in 2013 became the first person officially to have a death certificate stating air pollution as the cause of death. Pollution causes 1 out of 6 deaths globally from 2015 to 2019 and remains the world's largest environmental health threat, the study says. It's not just pollution. These are victims of climate change in Alaska and in California. And lest this sound hypothetical, when my family and I were taking a vacation in California, our plans for the vacation were totally disrupted because we were constantly trying to avoid wildfires. So instead of following our original plan, we followed a plan whereby we kept running away from the fires. Crucial tropical forests were destroyed at a rate of 10 soccer fields a minute last year. Wars are killing innocent people. Overuse of antibiotics is causing methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus bacteria to kill people. And lest the idea of people committing suicide sound hypothetical, in 2017, author Shauna Swan and her team of researchers found that over the past 4 decades, sperm levels among men in Western countries have dropped by more than 50%. They came to this conclusion after examining 185 studies involving close to 45,000 healthy men. So what do all these disasters have in common? Why am I even mentioning them? I mean, what's this have to do with the Western or any conception of intelligence? I would argue that these disasters are a result, directly or indirectly, of intelligence as it was originally conceptualized by Alfred Binet, Charles Spearman, and others in the West. High IQ, which is our usual conception of intelligence, and it can be IQ or it can be other standardized tests, it doesn't matter. But whatever it is, it has its advantages. It enables us to do well in IQ tests and other general intelligence-based tests. Enables some of us to set the alarm on hotel alarm clocks, not including me. I'm still old-fashioned. IQ predicts a lot of shorter and long-term individual successes. So I'm not arguing that IQ has no use. That's not my point at all. Rather, I'm arguing that even long-term success for the individual is short-term for humanity, and it has produced the tragedy of the commons. And what this means is that what's good for an individual over the short term can be disastrous for people collectively over the long term. And our conception of intelligence is based 100% on the individualistic conception of what's good for one person. So just as if you have too many sheep or cattle grazing in an area, you run out of grass. If you're talking about the Amazon, you run out of rainforest. Or if you talk about a traffic jam, what you find is a car may be good for one person, but if everyone's driving the cars, you have a traffic jam and it becomes much worse for everyone else. With a lot of people thinking, if these idiots would just take the bus, I could be home by now. Because the characteristics that lead to individual success, including on IQ tests, often lead to adverse long-term collective outcomes. So if we have a notion of intelligence designed to maximize individual benefits, to say to some people, wow, you're so great, you have A's in school, and you went to a prestigious university, and you got awards and a great job, eventually that may ram into the benefit of us all together. Each individual success sometimes has brought humanity and many other species closer to collapse. Moreover, conventional G-based general intelligence-based tests, although standardized, are not fair to everyone of any species. So if you had a bunch of animals and you said to them, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam, please climb that tree, that would seem silly. But when we put a bunch of kids in a room and some of them speak as a native language, the language of the test, and some don't, and some of them have parents who could afford great schooling and tutors and all kinds of educational benefits, and some don't. And some grew up going to very competitive, prestigious schools, and others went to schools that barely eked by. And some had parents who devoted their time in higher education to helping their kids succeed in school, and others have parents, or who, if they know who their parents are, who are working 3 jobs and don't have time to help them. What we're doing is not so different from what this guy is doing with the animals in the picture. Some people such as Steven Pinker, professor at Harvard, say things are getting much better. And in many ways they are. But the problem is not just today, tomorrow, or the next day, but over the long term for our children and grandchildren. And it's starting right now with wildfires, parched earth, hurricanes, and other natural disasters. The founders of the testing movement internationally had a well-intentioned goal. It was to create a meritocracy rather than a plutocracy. In other words, a society based on merit rather than money. And that's a good goal because kids who have wealthy parents have such advantages everywhere. If you look at the kids of Donald Trump, a former president of the United States, one has to wonder, if you hear them speak, whether they would have the success they have if they didn't have Trump as a father. Or if you listen to Hunter Biden and his legal problems, you doubt that he would have had such financial success if Joe Biden weren't his father. So the idea of testing was, let's go with merit, not with money. Sounds good. Who could argue? But the founders of the testing movement could not have known in the early 20th century how highly test scores and socioeconomic status would correlate and become intertwined. So the idea was to get away from a society where your prospects are based on parental wealth and status. But the squared correlation of testing with average income in this chart is about 0.95. In other words, standardized tests are not the same as parental income, but they're pretty damn close when you're talking about a 95 correlation. And it's understandable. It's I look at my own family. My parents didn't graduate from high school. I was a first-generation college student. My father sold buttons in a slum in Newark, New Jersey. My mother was a housewife. They both were poorly educated. They couldn't help me in school. And so I was like a lot of people from my background and doing poorly on IQ tests. My own kids have the benefits of my making a better salary and being more educated. And we're able to help them in school in a way my parents never could help me. So if we look at intelligence just as an individual trait, rather than as an interaction between the individual and the tasks the individual has to perform, and the environmental milieu in which that individual has to perform them, we miss the whole point. Intelligence doesn't exist just in the individual. It's always in the interaction between the individual and where or when he lives. As a college professor, I do pretty well, but if I lived in a hunter-gatherer society, my kids wouldn't eat. It's not just the testers who are responsible for our situation. We're all responsible for the current state of testing and our conceptions of intelligence, all of us. What society does is perpetuate the existing socioeconomic class structure and call it meritocracy. I don't know the Philippines very well, but many societies do this. You can decide the extent to which it's true in the Philippines that people who come from socioeconomically more elevated households start at a higher level. It's like in baseball, starting at second base or third base or getting 3 points. But people act as though these kids who have privileges have no advantages as a result of those privileges versus kids who come from more challenging environments. And I was one of those kids from a more challenging environment, and it was darn hard. And I was fortunate enough to be able to get through it. But there are others who aren't. There are others in our country, there are kids who they can't go to a decent school, or it's unsafe for them to go to school. They may not know who their parents are. They may go to a school where the teachers are barely educated. And we can't pretend that these factors don't affect their opportunities in life. So I've been critiquing conventional tests. And again, I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying they don't tell us anywhere near what they purport to tell us. So what are they missing? And that's what I'm going to talk about next. I would argue that the tests that measure conventional conceptions of intelligence, and this includes IQ tests, but also other tests that are proxies for IQ tests, achievement tests, they miss most of what matters for creating a better world where people can be intelligent in its true sense of adapting to the environment rather than destroying the environment and themselves in the process. We do have a choice. So I have been using a model I call 𝗥CELL, active concerned citizenship and ethical leadership, in saying that schools should be teaching not for who can memorize the most textbooks or the most in their lectures. When I took that introductory psychology course, that I failed the first test and got a C in the course, it was all about memorizing a book. Today, almost none of the material I learned in that course would be relevant to 2023 psychology. It's all dead. It's all stuff nobody cares about anymore. What I think matters is not memorizing books. Sure, you need knowledge, but the knowledge should be in the service of active concerned citizenship and ethical leadership. And the components of that, I would argue, are creativity, common sense or practical intelligence, and wisdom, in addition to domain general and domain specific analytical skills. So I want to say that the theory I have is not original. These elements are already included in many Eastern and indigenous conceptions of intelligence. For example, when we studied rural Kenyan conceptions of intelligence, we found that the rural Kenyans had 4 words relevant to intelligence: Rieko, which includes knowledge, ability, and skills. It is more like what we conventionally mean by intelligence. But also Luro, which is more like practical intelligence, Paro, which is more like creativity, and Winjo, which is more like wisdom. So in my view, ironically, the indigenous rural Kenyans, I believe, understand intelligence better than most, at least Western psychologists. They have a much more panoramic view of what intelligent people really do. What I call adaptive intelligence is not the same as IQ or general intelligence. It's one's ability to adapt to real world situations, not fake tests, but the real world, creatively, analytically, practically, and wisely. Adaptive intelligence is not about solving vocabulary problems and number theories and geometry problems and fake reading comprehension. Adaptive intelligence is about applying one's knowledge and skills to real problems, not the often fake ones with which schools present students. Adaptive intelligence is used not only narrowly to adapt to given environments, but also to shape those environments, and is necessary to select new environments when current environments are a bad fit to one's knowledge, skills, values, or goals. In other words, sometimes you change yourself to adapt to the environment. Sometimes you shape the environment to make it more conducive to you. And sometimes you get out, you find a new environment. And this remains true throughout our lives. It can be in a relationship. In an intimate relationship, you may first try to adapt, see whether you can fit the other person. Then you may try to shape your behavior, their behavior, so you fit better. And if that doesn't work, you may decide to select to find a different relationship. It applies to jobs. I'm at Cornell now. I was at Oklahoma State as provost and senior vice president, and those have worked out pretty well. But I was in another place where I was president of the university, and it was a terrible fit. I didn't belong with them. They didn't belong with me. It was a very, very conservative state, and I just didn't fit in. And I tried first to adapt to the job, and I couldn't. Then I tried to shape the job, and I couldn't. And so I resigned and left. And that's what adaptive intelligence is. It's realizing sometimes you can make things work, sometimes you can't. It's not about IQ test problems or multiple choice problems. It's about the real world. So let's talk first about creativity. Creativity is generating new ideas and products that are novel and useful. And here are examples of creativity tests of the kinds we have used in our research. Design a scientific experiment on a topic of your choice. Draw a picture of the beginning of time. Suppose the Nazis had won World War II. What would the world be like today? Write a creative story using the title, Social Media Died Today. Draw an advertisement for a new brand of bow tie. Create an exciting slogan for your school. Create a new game. So we don't ask the kids to do everything because creativity is largely domain specific. We ask them to choose the domain and to be creative within it. So this is not like the Torrance test or some of these common tests used to measure creativity, which have tests like what are unusual uses of a paperclip. What we're trying to do is really stretch the kids' imagination. Here's an example of a creative essay that we got when I was Dean of Arts and Sciences at Tufts University. And we had a project called Kaleidoscope, which was used to admit students to Tufts. And thousands of students, tens of thousands really, participated in Kaleidoscope. Here's an essay. If the Trojans had heeded Laocoon's advice and thrown Odysseus's wooden horse into the sea, they would have defeated the Greeks at Troy. Aeneas would then never have had reason to flee the city, and he would never have ventured to Italy to found Rome. Without Rome, neither the Roman Republic nor a Roman Empire would have existed. Concrete, the arch, plumbing, and the sauna might never have been invented. The modern implications of Rome never having existed are indeed drastic. Lacking even concrete floors, people would resort to sleeping in the mud. And without plumbing or saunas, they would be perpetually filthy and generally quite chilly. France could not have built the base of the Eiffel Tower without arches. So tourists would be unable to purchase miniature collectible towers in Parisian convenience stores. So this is an essay that was written by someone whose verbal SAT, the test used for admission at Tufts, wasn't that high. But it's clear that the tests that at least we use in the United States, they don't measure creativity. And this is a person who, whatever his verbal SAT, was very creative. And what we found at Tufts is that we could admit students who would not have been admitted by conventional tests and who did great in the university, both in terms of academic performance and extracurricular. So if you look at prediction of grade point average, this is the Rainbow Project. It's one of the last projects I did when I was a professor at Yale University for many years. We found that adding creative tests to the conventional analytical tests, the SAT, verbal, and math, pretty much almost doubled prediction of first-year grade point average. So even using a narrow criterion, like first-year GPA, we could almost double prediction success. And the reason we believe is that the first year of university, at least in the United States, is very different from high school. And it takes creative thinking to adapt to the novelty of switching from high school to university. We also found that when we used our tests, which are shown by the green and blue bars, we reduced substantially ethnic and racial group differences. And the reason for that is that different racial and ethnic and cultural groups have different conceptions of intelligence. And whereas the SAT and IQ tests are based very much on the valuing of abstract analytical thinking, other cultures more emphasize creative and practical thinking. And indeed, kids who grow up poor, whose parents don't have many resources, have to develop creative and practical skills and attitudes just to survive, to get to school, to get through school, to get through life. Whereas kids whose parents have a lot of money, a lot more is done for them, and there's less of a premium for them in developing creative and practical skills. So the tests we used both increased prediction and decreased racial and ethnic group differences. So I talked some about creativity. Let's talk about practical intelligence or common sense. And this is a Dilbert cartoon. And a job interviewer says, wow, you have 3 master's degrees and a PhD. And the job candidate says, yes, it's all very impressive. But interestingly, I have no common sense whatsoever. And the interviewer says, that's not the sort of thing you should say during a job interview. And the candidate says, I don't see why not, proving his lack of common sense. And all of us know people who are very smart IQ-wise, but not so great in the common sense department, and vice versa, people with high common sense who don't have the highest IQs. They're just different things. To be an effective leader, to be a good leader, you need a lot of common sense. And unfortunately, at least in our country, we don't have much of that among our leaders. I mean, it's like our leaders go to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and they're total duds. I mean, like, wow. You know, they may have done well in school, but their common sense is really pathetic. And we just ignore that when we conceive of intelligence in a narrow sense. Common sense or practical intelligence is using your knowledge and skills effectively to adapt to, shape, and select environments. So these are some problems we've used to measure common sense. How would you persuade a friend to adopt an idea of yours that he or she initially does not like? Or in the movie you just saw, how can the students get the mattress to the second floor? So they saw a movie with a picture of a winding staircase. The mattress wouldn't fit up. And given that the mattress does not fit up the winding staircase, or you see a movie where a student asks a professor for a letter of recommendation, and you can tell from the professor's face that he has no idea who the student is. In the movie you just saw, what should the student do given that the professor from whom she wants a letter of recommendation obviously does not recognize her? Or which of the following strategies would you use to study for an essay test? Or is the romantic couple real or fake? In that exercise, we showed couples, and they were couples that were purported to be in romantic relationships, but half of them were real and half of them were fake. And you had to identify by nonverbal cues which were real and which were fake. And we found that practical intelligence or common sense also increased prediction of first-year GPA, in this case by about 25%. Practical intelligence matters everywhere. Here are honeybee gatherers searching for beehives. How good are we all at searching for obscure beehives? So practical intelligence is not a general intelligence. It's specific to domains of inquiry. We did a project in rural Kenya on practical intelligence. This is a photo of the school. And here's a typical item. A small child in your family is Homa. She has a sore throat, headache, and fever. She has been sick for 3 days. Which of the following 5 𝗏 Luo herbal medicines can treat Homa? Now, you may wonder, where does this come from? What we discovered is that in rural Kenya, a really important part of practical and adaptive intelligence is avoiding and then treating parasitic and related illnesses, malaria, schistosomiasis, hookworm, whipworm. And the reason is that when the kids get these infections and they get them over and over again, they can't go to school and they don't learn and they fall behind. And so this item is typical of one of the items we used to measure their practical intelligence, not for some hypothetical school environment that might be relevant to a wealthier urban Kenyan kid, but to their lives. I want to say one other thing. When we did the study, many people said, well, big deal. That's rural Kenya. It's backward. It's third world, boo. But the truth is, those kids had a skill that proved to be extremely important in 21st century advanced civilization. Because when COVID-19 came, the pandemic, it was this kind of practical intelligence that saved people, not their IQs. At least in the United States and Europe, many people with very high IQs did not take sensible precautions. They somehow believed that They're too smart to get sick, and they got sick, and some of them died, including very, very so-called smart people. So the practical skills we measured in Kenya proved to be of crucial importance during the pandemic. What we found in our Kenya study was not what we expected. We expected practical and academic intelligence to show no correlation with each other. But instead, if you look at the first column, all the correlations were negative. In other words, the better you did on practical intelligence, the worse you did on academic intelligence. Why? Because in rural Kenya, the smart kids actually leave school earlier, not later. And the reason for that is that the occupations available don't require schooling. So if you're smart, you're hired out of school as an apprentice and you learn how to do a trade. If nobody thinks you're smart, you stay in school and you may do better on IQ tests or academic tests, but it doesn't help you in your life. And even in the United States, the people with the most education, PhDs, generally make less money than people with master's degrees. Certainly true for me. So what this finding shows is that IQ is really very limited in what it predicts. We also did a project in rural Alaska, a fishing village. Here's a problem we used. When Eddie runs to collect a ptarmigan that he just shot, he notices that its front pouch is full of ptarmigan food. This is a sign of what? And this is very relevant to survival in rural Alaska. And what we found in rural Alaska is that there were kids in school who teachers considered to be really quite dumb, but those kids could navigate 50 to 100 miles in the frozen tundra where there are no apparent landmarks and get to where they're going. Whereas if the teachers, who are academically much more sophisticated, tried to do the same thing, they would have died. So what we were measuring here were the practical intellectual skills kids need to survive. All these graphs show is that in the urban environments, the more developed environments, the kids who did better on the IQ tests excelled in school, but in rural environments, you were better off doing better on practical intelligence tests. The general point is that common sense is not the same as IQ. One could be high in both or low in both, but also high in one and low in the other. And anyone who has spent any time in academia, in schools, should already know that being generally intelligent, high IQ, does not guarantee that you have any common sense. So now let's talk about wisdom. Wisdom is using your knowledge and skills toward a common good by balancing your own, others, and larger interests over the long as well as the short term through the infusion of positive ethical values. So these are some wisdom problems we've used. Kor and Tamlin, two countries in the Middle East, are having a serious clash. The Tarim River flows in the direction from Kor to Tamlin. Tamlin claims that Kor is diverting more than its fair share of the water from the river. It's getting ready to go to war over this precious water resource. What should the two countries do? Or give an example of how some passion you have in your life now could be turned for a common good when you grow older. Or Richard and Jennifer broke up. They both left you text messages that they want to talk to you about what happened. You know they both will want you to take their side. What should you do? We used tests like these when I was dean at Tufts and also provost at Oklahoma State. And I won't go into great detail, but the bottom line is they improved prediction, both of academic and of extracurricular success. And they resulted in many kids whose backgrounds were challenging, who would not have been admitted by conventional tests and grades, nevertheless being admitted and succeeding. And the last set of studies I want to talk about are these. I had always assumed that IQ tests, although they were bad at measuring creative, practical, and wisdom-based skills, they don't measure them at all, really, that they would be good at measuring analytical skills. But that turned out not to be quite true. So we looked at STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematical reasoning. And the question was, is STEM reasoning the same as what is measured by domain general IQ proxies, or is it more domain specific? So here's what we did. We created some tests of what scientists actually do. One of those things is proposing alternative hypotheses. That's what you do in psychology, right? You get results and you say, what are different causes that could produce these results? So we had a problem. Marie is interested in child development. One day, she notices that whenever Laura's nanny comes in to pick up Laura from nursery school, Laura starts to cry. Marie reflects upon how sad it is that Laura has a poor relationship with her nanny. What are some alternative hypotheses regarding why Laura starts to cry when she's picked up from nursery school by the nanny? And this is so important because in psychology, as you know, often we have a prior hypothesis and all we do is try to confirm it. We have a confirmation bias. We prefer our own ideas. And so what we're looking at here is to be a good scientist, to be a good psychologist, clinical psychologist is the same. You have to look at alternative hypotheses as to why someone is showing certain symptoms. The second task was designing experiments. Here's an example. Ella, senior in college, observes that her roommate tends to perform better on an exam if she's had a cup of coffee beforehand. Ella hypothesizes that drinking coffee before taking an exam will significantly increase one's exam performance. However, Ella does not know how to test this hypothesis. Please suggest an experimental design to test this hypothesis and describe the experiment in some detail. Assume you have the resources you need to be able to do the experiment. And the third test was assessing the validity of conclusions, which we do all the time in psychology. Here's an example. Bill was interested in how well a new program for improving mathematical performance worked. He gave 200 students a pretest on their mathematical knowledge and skills. He then administered the new program to them. After administering the program, he gave the same 200 students a post-test that was equal in difficulty and in all relevant ways comparable to the pretest. He found that students improved significantly in performance from pretest to post-test. He concluded that the program for improving mathematical performance was effective. Is this conclusion correct? Why or why not? And the answer is no, because there was no control group. You have no idea, really, why the students improved. It could have been the program, it could have been time, it could have been something else. What we found is that the three tests of scientific reasoning correlated positively and factored with each other. Tests of fluid abilities of IQ, letter sets, number series, SAT, ACT, also correlated positively and factored with each other. But in a Cornell sample, at least, the tests of scientific reasoning showed trivial, or in some cases, negative correlations with the fluid ability measures. In other words, standardized tests were lousy predictors of who would succeed in scientific reasoning. So Our tests appear to measure reasoning skills different from those measured by standardized tests of intelligence. Standardized tests thus may provide incomplete and possibly sometimes misleading results for admission to STEM graduate programs. So I've talked about creativity, practical intelligence, analytical intelligence, wisdom. Other things matter: integrity, intrinsic motivation, mindset, passion for making a difference, active concerned citizenship, specific talents, emotional intelligence, rational thinking, critical thinking. I'm not saying that I've talked about everything. All I'm saying is that our conventional conception of intelligence is too narrow. And we may be missing the kids who have the most to contribute to the world. We may be missing the kids who, like me, get a 3 out of 10 on that introductory psychology test because they're not good memorizers, but actually may have some ideas later on that will make the world a better place. And that's what we need. We don't need people who memorize books. The stuff they're learning, we all know, and the stuff they're learning now is going to be out of date in a few years. They need to think and think like psychologists. The fly in the ointment is that standardized tests based on modern Western notions of intelligence are seriously limited and narrow because the Western notions of intelligence are limited and narrow. Why don't we go beyond these tests? And there are lots of reasons, but suffice it to say that medical testing has changed enormously since the early 20th century. You wouldn't want to use a 1905 medical test to see if you have cancer or heart disease. But in psychology, we're using IQ tests based on Stanford and on the Binet test of 1905 to measure intelligence. And I think that we just have to do better. A common conception of intelligence values people who are very good at doing what they're told and fitting into an existing cognitive, social, and economic structure. Even creative professions often value those who are creative, working within entrenched paradigms and who do not challenge the existing structure of the field. People who are highly creative or wise do not fit well into the structure and are challenged at every turn to stay in their place. So little changes because the existing power structure, which often is hidden, does not allow it to change. And that spells a dismal future. The problems facing the world are enormous, and psychologists and other behavioral scientists often have reacted as though these problems are not their problems, they're someone else's. They have persisted, especially in the field of intelligence, in being narrow, not realizing that if the world falls apart, there won't be a next generation to continue with small, self-satisfied approaches. I'm going to skip a few of these things because we're running out of time. My argument is we're running the wrong race. We're running to create new tests, new curricula that often teach and assess the wrong things. We need to go in the opposite direction. We need to be the black sheep who think differently. And I have argued that we need to be transformational in our deployment of intelligence instead of just looking for transactional people, people who are tit for tat. You give me something, I give you something. You give me something, I give you something. You identify me as smart, I'll get good grades. I get good grades, you admit me to a good university. I get into a good university, I'll graduate on time. I graduated on time, you give me a good job. You give me a good job, I make money, blah, blah, blah. We need people who are transformational, who want to make the world a better place. And so let's make the world a better place.